The motorcade pulled away from the tower just before 4 in the morning, and Naomi Carter stood at the window with a glass of water she hadn't touched. 12 floors below, taillights disappeared onto Marine City Road, swallowed by the dark curve of Hyundai's coastline. She counted the seconds until the sound of the engines faded completely. Then she picked up her phone, dialed a number with a Savannah area code, and said 4 words before hanging up. The shipment moved again. She was, to anyone watching, the quietest woman in Busan. She was also, though nobody in that building knew it yet, the quietest weapon in a war that hadn't started. Cho Seung-min did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. When he walked into the Baeko Consortium's 20th floor offices that morning, the room went still, the way water goes still, before a stone breaks the surface. Men who had killed for him could not meet his eyes. He asked one question about a missing shipment out of the port, and the silence that followed told him everything. Somewhere in his organization, a hole had opened up, and money was pouring through it. Han Do-yoon, his second in command, answered too quickly, too smoothly, the kind of answer a man gives when he has already rehearsed it. Seung-min filed that away, the way he filed everything away, without expression, without comment, and without forgetting. At home, Naomi kept a drawer locked in the study, a small brass key on a chain she wore under her blouse. When Seung-min asked about it once, she told him it held old letters from her grandmother, nothing more. He believed her, because he had never once considered that his wife might be more complicated than the role she played. To him, she was elegant furniture, expensive, well-chosen, and silent. She spent her days arranging flowers shipped in from Jeju, and writing in a leather journal he assumed held nothing but idle thoughts. He had married her for a signature on a shipping contract and a name that opened doors at the port of Savannah. Love had never been part of the arrangement, and neither of them pretended otherwise. What he didn't know was that Naomi had grown up behind the counter of her grandmother Ruth Carter's restaurant on Habersham Street, in the historic heart of Savannah, learning to read a room full of strangers before she learned to read a cookbook. Ruth had fed dock workers and union men, preachers and federal witnesses who needed a quiet table and a door that didn't squeak. Naomi had inherited her grandmother's recipes. She had also inherited something far more dangerous, an instinct for knowing exactly who was lying to her, and a network of people back home who still owed the Carter family favors nobody had forgotten. 6 months into the marriage, Seung-min came home late, jaw tight, and found Naomi waiting with a question about his day. He answered the way he always did, short, dismissive, the tone of a man explaining something simple to someone who couldn't possibly understand it. "It's business, Naomi. You wouldn't follow it." She smiled, poured him a drink, and said nothing. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Each time, she filed it away too. Before we go further, I want to ask you for something small. If this story has already pulled you in, hit that subscribe button and tap like right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. Now let's get back to it, because what happens at that dinner table is going to change everything you think you know about this family. 200 kilometers north, in Incheon, a man named Bak Ji-hoon was building an army out of resentment. Bak didn't want a piece of the Baeko Consortium's shipping routes. He wanted Seung-min's name erased from every port ledger from Busan to Savannah. A lieutenant who'd once worked under Baekek and survived to tell about it described what happened to a business partner who'd shorted him on a deal. The man was found in a shipping container 3 weeks later, and nobody in Incheon spoke his name again. Baek didn't make examples, he made disappearances. Han Do-yoon had been quietly meeting with Baekek's people for 2 months. He told himself it was insurance. He told himself Seung-min had passed him over for the western shipping lanes one time too many, that loyalty only went so far when a man's ambition kept getting stepped on. He didn't tell himself the whole truth, that he was selling out an empire because his pride had been wounded, and pride, once it curdles, doesn't ask permission before it becomes betrayal. Then a lieutenant named Seung, a man who had served Seung-min for 11 years, was pulled out of Busan harbor with his hands bound. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. It was a message, and everyone in the consortium heard it. Seung-min stood on the dock at dawn, looking at a tarp covering a man he'd known since he was 23 years old, and for the first time in a decade, he felt something close to fear. War with Baek Ji-hoon would cost him everything. His shipping lanes, his men, possibly his life. He had one option left, and he hated it. Sit across a table from Baek and negotiate a peace he didn't want. If a story like this one keeps you watching until the end, do me a favor and drop a comment below. Even just a word or two. It tells me people are actually out there feeling this with me, and it means more than you'd think. That same week, an old capo named Kwon Tae-sik, a man who'd been with Seung-min's father before him, mentioned Naomi's grandmother almost in passing, the way you mention something you assume nobody will remember. My cousin ate at a restaurant in Savannah once, run by a black woman named Carter. Said people used to line up outside just for her cornbread. Nobody in the room thought much of it. Seung-min didn't either. He had no reason to. The night before his meeting with Baek, Seung-min came home carrying the weight of a war he didn't want and a lieutenant he couldn't bring back. Naomi asked if he was all right. He told her, without looking up from his glass, that it was too complicated to explain. The kind of thing that required years in his world to understand, not a woman who spent her afternoons with flowers. She nodded and said nothing, the way she always did, filing the moment away with all the others. The next evening, he brought 6 of his most trusted men home, for what he expected to be a stiff, forgettable dinner, before the real business began the following morning. He told the private chef to prepare something simple. He told Naomi, almost as an afterthought, to stay upstairs and let the staff handle it. Instead, when the men arrived, they found the kitchen already occupied. Naomi had sent the chef home. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair was pulled back, and she moved through that kitchen with a certainty none of them had ever seen in her before. Seung-min opened his mouth to say something and then didn't, because for the first time since he'd married her, his wife wasn't looking at him like a woman waiting for instructions. She was looking at him like a woman who already knew exactly how the night was going to end. One more thing before we get to the part you've been waiting for. If you haven't already, tap subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like this one deserve to reach people who need a little inspiration today, and you sharing this with someone could be exactly what they needed to hear. The first plate went down in front of Kwon Tae-sik, the oldest man at the table, the one who remembered a different Korea, a harder one. Burnt sugar-glazed short ribs, dark and glistening, next to hand-pulled noodles in a rich doenjang broth that smelled like something none of them could quite place. Not fully Korean, not fully anything they'd tasted before, but unmistakably like a kitchen where someone had cooked with their whole heart. Beside it sat a square of golden cornbread, laced with gochugaru, sweet and sharp at the same time. Kwon took the first bite. Then he stopped chewing. One by one, down the table, the room went silent. Not the silence of suspicion, not the silence Seung-min's men used when they smelled danger. This was something else entirely. This was the silence of 6 hardened men tasting, for the first time in years, something that felt like home. And as Seung-min watched his most dangerous men go quiet over a woman he had never once taken seriously, he understood, with a cold and sudden clarity, that he had misjudged something. He just didn't yet know how badly. Naomi set down the last plate, wiped her hands on a towel, and looked at her husband with an expression he had never seen on her before. "Before anyone says another word," she said, calm as still water, "I think you should know something about Han Do-yoon." The room did not move, not one man breathed. Seung-min's hand tightened around his glass, but he didn't speak. Around the table, 6 men who had just tasted something that felt like home now sat frozen, waiting to see what their boss would do with the words his wife had just said. "She's not finished," Naomi continued, setting the towel down. 3 weeks ago, money started moving out of one of your Busan accounts and into a shell company registered in Incheon. My family still has friends at the port of Savannah who watch these things. Old habits from my grandmother's days, favors that never really expire. The account traces back to Han Do-yoon. Han's face didn't move, but his hand, resting on the table, went white at the knuckles. Kwon Tae-sik set down his fork. The young capo, a hot-tempered man named Yoon Ji-hwan, who'd said almost nothing all night, looked at Han like he was seeing him for the first time. Seung-min said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at his wife, really looked at her, and something in his chest rearranged itself. Every time he'd waved her off, every time he'd told her business was too complicated for someone like her, replayed in his mind with a different, uglier meaning. She hadn't been decoration. She'd been watching the whole time, and she'd seen more than he had. "We'll discuss this," he said quietly, "after everyone leaves." The men filed out into the night with a new kind of respect on their faces, not for Seung-min, but for the woman standing in his kitchen with flour still on her sleeve. When the door closed behind the last of them, Seung-min turned to Naomi with something between anger and disbelief. "You knew. For weeks, you knew. And you said nothing." "You never asked," she said, calm as ever. "And even if you had, would you have listened to me? Or would you have told me it was too complicated?" He didn't answer, because he didn't have one. "I'm not your ornament, Seung-min," she went on. "I married into this because it protected my family's business too. My grandmother built something out of nothing in a city that didn't want her to have it, and I will not let it fall apart because your pride kept you from seeing what was standing right in front of you. I've been protecting your empire from the shadows since the day I moved in. I just never told you, because you never once asked what I was capable of." The anger drained out of him slowly, replaced by something quieter and harder to name. For the first time since their wedding, he looked at his wife, not as an asset, but as an equal, a partner he had badly underestimated. He didn't apologize out loud, but he pulled out a chair, sat down across from her at the table still covered in half-finished plates, and asked her, for the first time, what she thought they should do about Han Do-yoon. "If you've made it this far, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it's the reason I get to keep telling stories like this one." Now let's find out just how far Han Do-yoon is willing to go. Han Do-yoon didn't sleep that night. He knew what discovery meant in Seung-min's world, and he knew waiting for the axe to fall was a coward's death. By morning, he'd made his choice. He called Baek Ji-hoon and moved up the timeline. The meeting scheduled to broker peace would instead become an ambush. Baek's men would flood the consortium's headquarters in Hamondae, and Han would make sure the doors were unlocked from the inside. Baek Ji-hoon arrived 2 days later, believing he already held every card. He walked into the consortium's boardroom flanked by 4 men, expecting a broken rival ready to surrender his shipping lanes and his American port connections without a fight. Instead, he found Seung-min standing calm at the head of the table, Kwon Tae-sik at his right hand, and every loyal man in the building already stationed and waiting. "You look surprised," Seung-min said. Baek's smile faltered for the first time in the story. "Where's Han?" "Right here," Seung-min said, and gestured toward the door, where 2 of Yoon Ji-hwan's men brought Han Do-yoon in, hands bound, his face pale with the particular fear of a man who has just realized his plan collapsed before it began. "Your money trail wasn't as clean as you thought," Seung-min told him. "My wife's family has been watching Savannah's shipping routes since before you were old enough to hold a gun. You should have asked who you were really dealing with before you sold me out." Baek Ji-hoon's men, seeing the room already secured and their advantage gone, hesitated at the door. It was the hesitation of men who had walked into a trap built for someone else. Baek reached for the leverage he thought he still had, threats about the Savannah port, about federal scrutiny, about burning Seung-min's empire to the ground publicly. But every card he tried to play had already been accounted for, flagged weeks earlier by a network Naomi's grandmother had built long before Baek Ji-hoon ever picked up a gun. It ended quickly, and it ended badly for Baek. Stripped of the element of surprise and the men he'd counted on inside, he was given a choice: leave Busan permanently or don't leave the building at all. He chose to leave, humiliated in front of the very rival he'd come to destroy. Han Do-yoon's fate was quieter, but final. A man who traded loyalty for ambition, left with nothing but the wreckage of both. We're almost at the end of this one, and I want to say thank you for sticking with it. If this story meant something to you, drop a word in the comments. Someone else scrolling past might need to hear it too. Weeks later, the kitchen in the penthouse overlooking Hyundai was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Naomi stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, chopping vegetables for a meal that was, this time, for no one but her and her husband. Seung-min came in and, instead of retreating to his study the way he always had, pulled up a stool and watched her work. "Teach me," he said. She looked at him, surprised, and then almost smiled. "Which part?" "All of it," he said. "I spent 6 months assuming there was nothing here worth learning. I was wrong about that. I don't want to be wrong about it again." She handed him a knife and showed him how to cut an onion, the way her grandmother had taught her. Slow, deliberate, no wasted movement. It wasn't romantic, not in the way people usually meant the word. It was something steadier than that. Respect, finally, in a room that had once only held silence and suspicion. The lesson in all of it was simple, and it was one Seung-min would carry with him long after that night. Never mistake someone's quiet for weakness. Never assume the person serving the meal has nothing to offer the table. The people this world teaches us to overlook are, more often than not, the very ones holding everything together. And respect, real respect, is rarely built in the loudest rooms. It's built in the quiet ones, one shared meal at a time. If this story reminded you that the quiet people in your own life deserve a second look, that's exactly why I make these. Subscribe, turn on your notifications, and I'll see you in the next one.